So, Maître Chaudry, you will be leading the interview this morning?
Witnesses this morning, who are officials from the Prime Minister's office, be sworn or affirmed.
All right, so I'll start with Mr. Clow. Mr. Clow, could you please state your full name and then spell your last name for the record? Thank you. Now for the affirmation. Do you solemnly affirm that you shall tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Now I'll proceed with Ms. Telford. Ms. Telford, could you please state your full name and then spell your last name for the record?
Catherine Alana Telford, Telford.
Thank you. Now for the affirmation. Do you solemnly affirm that you shall tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. And finally, for Mr. Travers, could you please state your full name and spell your last name for the record?
Patrick Travers, Travers.
Perfect, thank you. And for the affirmation, do you solemnly affirm that you shall tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Counsel, you may proceed.
Perfect, thank you. Witnesses, you've been here before, so you know the drill. We're going to start with routine housekeeping. There are 3 interview and examination summaries to enter, so I'm just going to read the document IDs into the record, and for each of them, I'll ask you to confirm that you've reviewed them for accuracy and adopt their contents as part of their evidence. So the first one is WIT 107, which is the PMO Stage 2 interview summary. The second is WIT 163, which is the PMO Stage 2 in-camera hearing summary. The third is WIT 161, which is the PMO addendum to the Stage 1 in-camera hearing summary. So again, for each of those, I'll ask you to confirm that you've read them, they're accurate, and you adopt their contents. Mr. Clow?
Yes.
Ms. Telford?
Yes.
Mr. Travers?
Yes.
Thank you. Then the last document is the PMO institutional report. CAN Doc 38 is the English version. CAN Doc 39 is the French. So Ms. Telford, on behalf of PMO, I'll ask you to confirm that you reviewed that report and you're content that it formed part of PMO's evidence before the Commission.
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. And then again, I'll just ask you to, I know you've been here before and you've done it before, but for everyone's benefit, reintroduce yourselves and explain your current roles and any roles you've held during the Commission's period of review, which is roughly 2018 to the present. Starting at my left, Mr. Travers.
Yes, I'm the Senior Global Affairs Advisor in the Prime Minister's Office. Prior to 2020, I served as a Senior Policy Advisor in the PMO Policy Team, starting in January 2016.
Thank you. Ms. Telford.
I'm the Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, and I've been the Chief of Staff throughout the time period you mentioned, except for when I've been on unpaid leave during the election periods.
Both 2019 and 2021?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Clow?
I joined the Prime Minister's office in 2017, focused solely on Canada-US relations. After the 2019 election, I took on responsibility for issues management and parliamentary affairs, in addition to Canada-US relations. And from 2021 onward, I have been Deputy Chief of Staff.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, we'll dive right into some of the substance here, starting with something you're quite familiar with, flow of information to the Prime Minister's office. So here, we know that there have been some changes throughout the period of review of the Commission. So Ms. Telford, I'll actually ask you to start by going back and reminding us of some of the things that you gave us at Stage 1 of the Commission's proceedings, where you distinguish between different time periods. And I think those were sort of pre-pandemic, how things happened during the pandemic, and post-pandemic. So again, can you remind us of those and then go on to explain any changes that have happened more recently?
So starting with pre-pandemic, we received most products to do with intelligence and security in paper. We received weekly and daily briefs or summaries, and the weekly ones were really summaries of what were coming in every day. And then very little raw intelligence was shared unless it was on a very specific situation, and if there was raw intelligence to be shared, it was usually because it was urgent and on a specific situation, and they would send a CRO or a client relations officer over to bring it to us and show it to us sort of immediately. But that was pretty rare pre-pandemic. Then during the pandemic, everything changed as it did for everyone. And during the pandemic, we obviously couldn't receive the same amount of information when we were in a lockdown period. But things got coordinated so that if there was something that something that the security officials, the senior officials believed we needed to see, either they would coordinate to sometimes, rarely, but they would sometimes come to my home or I would come into the office. And sometimes they would find ways that they could share it electronically by cleansing it somewhat so that it could come down a level of classification. But it was a more complicated period in that sense. There were not the daily briefs or the weekly products in the same way being delivered by paper, certainly. And then as we came out of the pandemic period, and I would point to sort of post the 2021 election, it became, as it did for so many people during that period, more of a hybrid system, partly because of learnings from that period and partly because in the sense that we now had technology we didn't have before. During the pandemic period, many of the senior staff, certainly the ones involved in this space, had access to secure level screens as well as secure level, or secret level, sorry, I should say, phones. And so that assisted in terms of sharing information, even if it couldn't go all the way to the top secret level. And so some of that was able to continue for the purposes of aiding information flow following the pandemic. We still have that technology, of course. And then we also got back into the process of sharing paper, though there was a lot more raw intelligence being shared following that period, partly because of events in the world, partly I think because national security and intelligence advisors, of which there have been several over the years that I have been in this role, each one has been a bit different in terms of where their focus has been because of events in the world, because of what the intelligence priorities were at the time that they would come to with cabinet and with the Prime Minister, and then partly due to their styles. And then post-leaks would be sort of the final period where things really became significantly more rigorous. And so almost all information now is shared via a client relations officer. And even over the time period that this inquiry has been going on and since that leaks period, I would say that the national security and intelligence advisors have put a particular emphasis on how to make the process that much more rigorous, both in terms of tracking the information, who's seeing what when, also being able to share that between us so that when I'm being briefed, I'm being told the Prime Minister has already seen this document or had questions on this document, or similarly, if he's being briefed, he can be alerted to the fact that one of us had asked for follow-up on something that he was reading so that he could have a sense of where something was already tracking to. And I think that would cover it mostly.
I think it probably does. So just to go back on a little bit of that, the pandemic period, you would put really from sort of when it hit in March 2020 to around the fall of 2021, when things may have started to normalize. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And in terms of you've sort of given us the post-pandemic and the post-leaks period and the increasing rigor you said in both tracking and provision of information. Can you speak to any ongoing challenges that still exist in the system in terms of when you receive information, what you can do with it?
I think an adjustment that's going to continue to get looked at and we continue to talk about between the clerk of the Privy Council, the National Security and Intelligence Advisor, the deputy clerk, myself, and some of us, is, and you'd rather lean toward the rigor than not, but that it's become, it is, everything flows through a client relations officer now, which means you need that person in front of you in order to review anything. And if you can't complete a document while they're sitting there because something else arises, you then need to reschedule that, and you can't do that later in the day. Whereas previously, if you were working your way through what can sometimes be a significant amount of information, we do have top secret safes. We do have top secret cleared assistants who can work with us on maintaining that information. And there may be a way to kind of be able to be a little more flexible on some of those fronts, but that's still something we're trying to work through.
Okay, fair enough. And last question on this, just to give an idea of when information comes to you, what it looks like. Generally speaking, when you receive intelligence products, and you've told us you're receiving more and more of it as a result of sort of everything that's going on in the world right now, do those intelligence products usually involve the names of the people who are mentioned in these in the intelligence, or are those sanitized out?
When they involve, and my colleagues may want to jump in here, since we don't all see the exact, we don't see all of the same things. The names of Canadians are usually not included.
Okay.
And so we might see if it was something international names, but if it's Canadians, usually it's the names are taken out, and we would have to request, if it's something where we believe knowing the name could be helpful, we would request, and the client relations officer would take that back to the NSIA to talk to the security agencies about whether that's a name that they can reveal to us or not.
Understood. Mr. Travers, Mr. Clow, anything to add on that?
No, I would say my experience is that generally the default is the names are not provided, with the exception potentially of foreign individuals, and that can also apply in some cases to Five Eyes as well. So the rule is generally not an identification of individuals.
Okay. We're going to move on to talk about a couple of specific intelligence products that have come up over the course of the Commission's proceedings. The first one is something that we know as the targeting paper. So in brief, this was a document drafted by a CSIS analyst originally in 2021. It wasn't disseminated anywhere until February 2023, when it was disseminated to a small number of people within the public service. And then the intention, we know, was to prepare a sanitized version of that for possible further dissemination. So first question is just to confirm, did you receive a version of the targeting paper in 2023?
No.
Okay. But you've now seen the targeting paper, is that correct?
We saw it after NCRA published its report.
Okay. And when we discussed this in your interview and your examination, I believe you were asked whether you should have seen it at the time, and your answer was, well, that's the NSIA's determination to make. Since then, we've heard evidence from the NSIA at the time, Ms. Thomas, that in fact she never made that determination. She never decided where it would go because she never received the updated sanitized version of that targeting paper. So I just want to confirm, first of all, the source of your information that was conveyed in the interview and examination summary, that it was her determination to make. Do you have any personal knowledge of her having received this, or was this from what was written in the NCRA report?
So no, we did not have any knowledge other than the NCRA report and what it said.
Okay, so no reason to dispute Ms. Thomas's recollection?
Right.
Okay. One issue that came up in the discussion of the targeting paper, which I want to ask you about, is, and it's mentioned in the discussion in the NCRA report of it, is whether the activity described in it necessarily constituted foreign interference or something less nefarious. Standard diplomatic activity of thinking about which parliamentarians a state could essentially work on for influence. And I'm wondering, I know this is something we've discussed before as well, but if you can give us your perspective, whether it's with respect to the targeting paper specifically or more generally, but on that distinction between what is foreign interference and what is foreign influence.
So maybe I'll kick off and then turn to my colleagues, but I think it's an ongoing discussion and debate depending on what assessment we're looking at. It particularly tends to come up in our domain when it comes to security clearances. So for example, I think one of the things we've talked about in the past is, is a member of parliament sometimes will be referred to as being vulnerable to a specific foreign entity or to a consul general or to an ambassador or somebody like that. Vulnerable doesn't necessarily mean that they have done anything. It could just mean that they could become a target or of that country or that individual. We also tend to look at, influence versus, and so they could be being influenced, they could be being interfered with potentially. So should that block them from moving forward? And we will have those discussions and debates all the time. There's kind of a gray zone between influence and interference. Where does influence cross into interference? And Global Affairs Canada, for example, and the diplomats within the government community and the global affairs kind of community have different experiences and different perspectives as to what is normal activity, diplomatic activity, than what we might see coming out of a CSIS assessment and out of different parts of the security apparatus. And the National Security and Intelligence Advisor is actually put in the position where they can convene those different parties and try to come to a common assessment, or at least identify what the different points of views are, so that a debate can be held at the senior most levels and or presented to the Prime Minister if it's something that's actually going to the Prime Minister.
Mr. Travers.
I agree entirely with that. What I'll add is I think that the National Security Intelligence Advisor put it very well, that there is a common working definition of foreign interference. The question then comes how you apply that to a specific set of facts and a specific set of behavior, particularly recognizing often there is either contingent or incomplete information about what's happening. And so to that degree, we do see across government different perspectives on different cases. And to some extent, that's useful as you're trying to understand in the context of intelligence and sometimes imperfect information, what may be occurring.
Okay. So when there are those different perspectives, from your vantage point at PMO, do you see them? Are they brought to you, or is there always a consensus before you see it?
I would say often not a consensus. And we are frequently faced with situations where we're presented with information that may be characterized in a certain way, characterized as foreign interference, and we, officials, others may look at that and say, well, hold on a second, is that foreign interference? And you've heard testimony here that I agree with, that, in certain instances, merely assembling information about a member of parliament, I would not say is on its own foreign interference. Canada, I talked about my role in Canada-US relations. We have an election coming up. We do a lot of work assembling information on prominent Americans. That is totally appropriate, totally normal. It's in our advantage. There's nothing wrong with it. Other countries do that to us. So often we have this discussion, and it's not just political staff versus officials. Officials are in these discussions as well. These situations are rarely black and white, so we often have to deconstruct them and think it through.
Do you think it hampers at all the efficiency of government response, this discussion?
No, I think it's actually a very healthy tension, and I think you see it in a number of different subject areas within government where you have different departments who come at things with different views. And in this area, I think it's particularly important when you're talking about the security of the country, when you're talking about individuals and their reputations, their livelihoods, the impact, what allegations are being made or assertions are being made, especially when it's coming from imperfect information, because so often intelligence is imperfect information. It may be coming from a corroborated or an uncorroborated source that has or hasn't been relied upon in the past, and it may have some parts that are known to be accurate and parts that aren't, and you've got to put the whole story together. So you need different perspectives, I think, to do that.
Okay, we're going to move on to talk about another intelligence product that has been mentioned in the Commission's work. This one's called the PCO Special Report. That's another document that was mentioned in the NCR report, among others. So this was a report on PRC foreign interference, combined both domestic and foreign intelligence, produced by the Intelligence Assessment Secretariat at PCO. And in early 2022, just to introduce the question, IAS indicated that this should be circulated to senior civil servants and perhaps beyond that. That document we now know was never finalized, and so just to confirm again, the PCO Special Report never reached you in 2022.
Correct.
Okay. But I understand you've now seen the PCO Special Report.
We saw this report in 2023. It was one that was talked about in the media.
Okay. So my question is, having now seen it, is this the kind of document you would have expected to see, you would have wanted to see? Would having seen it have changed things for you in the spring of 2022?
We have a lot of confidence in the current NSIA and the previous NSIAs to make decisions on what comes to us. There's so much information in the system that they have to exercise their judgment. We have a lot of confidence in their judgment. A lot of the information in that particular document we were aware of. Not all of it, perhaps not every specific, but the themes, the description, the information about Chinese foreign interference we were well aware of. So we trust the judgment of officials who chose not to send us that information, that particular document, I should say.
Okay. Anything else to add on that, or we'll move on to the next topic? So this one, I'm going to ask you sort of generally to start, and at this point I'll ask the court registrar to please pull up WIT 163, which is your in-camera hearing summary, just to follow along a bit of the discussion and as the examination goes along. So this is at paragraph 21. The discussion starts. The role of PMO here in policy development. So first, generally, I'll ask you to explain what that role is. So in terms of how ministerial proposals get to cabinet, the cabinet agenda, how does PMO work with line departments, with PCO? So Mr. Travers, I see you nodding, so this one's going to you.
Thank you. So at the highest level of policymaking as it relates to cabinet, ministers take the lead on putting specific proposals for consideration by their colleagues and by cabinet as a whole. And those proposals are consistent with the mandate letters that are provided by the Prime Minister and the overall government agenda. PMO plays a role in this process, working very closely with the Privy Council Office in managing the overall agenda, so sequencing prioritization of agenda items. And that's because together with PCO, we have an overarching view of the issues within government, of the whole agenda, and are able to manage that process moving forward. In practice, that means working not just with PCO, but with our colleagues' ministers' offices and other departments, as well as these proposals are brought forward. There are other ways in which policy decisions and policy proposals are brought forward. That can include letters from ministers, the Prime Minister, or decision notes provided by PCO. Again, we work very closely with our colleagues in the public service, and there we would play a role in terms of providing substantive advice for the Prime Minister. As part of this process, it is very common that we engage in fairly wide coordination across government as these proposals are brought forward.
Okay. Mr. Clow, I believe when we talked about this before, you noted that PMO can play, I think you called it an air traffic control function. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, there's so much policymaking that goes on. A lot of it flows from mandate letters. And after the 2021 election, as noted here, there were over 700 specific commitments in those mandate letters that went out to all ministers. That is a huge amount of work and activity that needs to be managed and overseen and coordinated. In addition to those 700, though, there's a lot that we are reacting to, so there's more policy on top of those 700, and there are proposals that come from ministers, from caucus, from others that get considered as well. So it's a lot of information flow, it's a lot of material consideration, and we play an air traffic control function.
Okay, sort of, and that I suppose is figuring out what to do when, prioritizing,
Exactly.
Coordinating?
Exactly.
Okay. So let's bring that home by talking about how the government's policy response to foreign interference specifically developed. And here I'll ask the court registrar to pull up a document called ComSum 4, which is the summary of the HASA memorandum to cabinet. So to situate you a little bit here, witnesses, in stage one of the commission's proceedings, we heard about two major cabinet proposals on foreign interference. First was the 2019 plan to protect Canada's democracy, and then in 2021, the plan to protect Canada's democracy 2.0, essentially, working off the recommendations that were made in the Judd report. In stage two, what we've become acquainted with, I would say, the HASA MC, so Memo to Cabinet on Hostile Activities by State Actors. And we know that this was brought to Cabinet in May 2022, ratified in June 2022. So the question I want to ask you here is sort of what happened next? Once this gets to Cabinet and it gets ratified, what's the response?
Do you want to take that?
Do you want to take the question?
So I'm happy to talk about a bit of the timeline there. So June 2022, this MC gets ratified at Cabinet, and that set off a whole bunch of additional work. First, we consulted internally within government. We consulted with stakeholders who might be interested in the contents of what was being considered here. The Foreign Agents Registry was a key part of this proposal. Ultimately, the government launched from public safety consultations on the Foreign Agent Registry in the spring of 2023. Even developing that consultation takes a fair bit of work and time. So the consultation was launched in the spring of 2023. It came after that, the registry was further developed, so it came back to Cabinet in June of 2023 for further consideration. In the fall of 2023, government consulted on other elements of the legislation that eventually was introduced, so amendments to the CSIS Act, amendments to the Security of Information Act, other amendments, criminal code. That was consulted at some length in the fall of 2023. And ultimately, all of this was discussed one more time at Cabinet earlier this year before the legislation was introduced. It's a piece of legislation that's a little over 100 pages. It's incredibly detailed. It amends a number of acts, and it affects a lot of things in this country and how security agencies operate. And so we took the time that we felt was needed to get this right. And I would say the fact that once we introduced it into Parliament and it moved so quickly shows that we did get it right. We were criticized by some for taking too long to introduce that bill. We were criticized by others for moving too quickly. And again, I think we did get it right. The bill has passed and it's now being implemented.
Okay, thank you. That's a helpful overview of the timeline. If I could ask the registrar to just zoom out a little bit so we can see the four elements here in the HAS.
I think Mr. Travers wanted to add something.
Oh, I saw that. Don't worry. I'm getting to him. But before I ask Mr. Travers to add what he wants to add, I just want to go through what we see here in the HAS MC. So the first sort of part of it here is, or element that's discussed is endorsement of the principles in the counter-HAS strategy. The second part, it involves a whole of government communications approach. The third part is counter-HAS legislative tools, particularly the CSIS Act, the Criminal Code, and the Security of Information Act. And then the fourth part is new capabilities for the RCMP. Okay, Mr. Travers, I will now ask you, before I move on with my further questions, to add whatever it is you were planning to.
No, absolutely, and it relates to what we laid out within the HAS MC. I just wanted to provide, to Brian's point, a bit of broader context on policy this complex and this sensitive. When we came into government, it was shortly after there had been a broad public debate about the previous government under Prime Minister Harper's efforts to reform national security architecture C-51. We then moved forward with C-59, which made substantial changes in the national security space, including with respect to increasing oversight. And what we learned through those processes is that, first, anything that touches to the core of the powers of the national security agencies, the oversight, and frankly, the rights of Canadians is hugely sensitive and needs to be taken very carefully. And that because of that, the consultation process with those affected is also hugely important. And so it's important to understand the HASA-MC process in light of that experience and in light of the importance of the policy issues that are being addressed there. And you see this here in terms of the breadth of the legislative amendments, but also the kind of powers that are being provided as we move forward.
Okay, thank you. Staying on the theme of how this all developed, can I ask the registrar to pull up CAN 18005? So, Mr. Cloud, this is a text exchange from November 2022. I think it was probably right after the media leaks between you and the then Minister of Public Safety, Marco Mendicino. Do you recognize this exchange? Okay.
Yes, I do.
So if we just see what's here at page 1, It starts with a discussion on overseas police stations, and I think, Mr. Clow, this is you in this sort of the black here, white on black writing. Mr. Clow saying we need to take a more, or give a more robust response. It can't be CSIS alone going out there and giving responses. And then if we scroll down to the second page, we'll see Mr. Mendocino's response after also good morning, which essentially says he agrees, he's relieved to hear you say it. He thinks it's appropriate to take a more robust position publicly, and then asks for your help on pushing ahead with policy and investments, which he says have been hard for a variety of reasons. So, Mr. Clow, can you tell us the context of this discussion? What was going on here?
So as you pointed out, this was a few days after Sam Cooper's first story based on leaks. And that first story was explosive. It was about the so-called 11 candidates. And so for a few days in Ottawa and in the country, there was a huge amount of media attention on this topic. So the first part of the exchange is Minister Mendocino and I discussing how to respond to new questions that were coming in on the topic of foreign interference. And my reference to it can't be CSIS alone speaking to this is because, rightly, CSIS can't say anything. They couldn't speak to specific allegations. So these allegations were hanging out there. So that's what the first part of the discussion refers to. Second part, Minister Mendocino replies, asks for assistance on the policy response. And at this point, I talked about the timeline earlier. At this point in the process, we were a few months after the HASA MC was considered at Cabinet, and we were discussing how to construct the consultation. And that's what was happening that fall. So we were doing the work that was needed to be done to get that consultation launched.
Okay, and I think you said the consultation was then launched in the spring of 2023.
Right.
Okay. I think we can take that down now. And I think you've already given us some history on how those consultations unfolded. Is there anything else you want to add on the topic of the consultations and how they were planned and took place before we move on to another topic? No? Okay. The next topic then we're going to talk about is a little bit different, unclassified briefings to parliamentarians. So for this one, Registrar, I'll ask you to pull up COM 363. And scroll down to paragraph 126. So what we see here at paragraph 126 of the NSICOP report is a narration of events having to do with an initiative intended to provide unclassified briefings to parliamentarians that for various reasons doesn't appear to have materialized. So it starts with saying in 2018, in the NSICOP's report on the Prime Minister's visit to India, the committee recommended that members of the House of Commons and Senate should be briefed upon being sworn in and regularly thereafter on foreign interference. That was then repeated in the NSICOP's 2019 report and became the subject of a memo from the clerk of the Privy Council to the Prime Minister, which did not receive a formal response from PMO. Then speaks about a second memo from the sent to the PMO, this time by the NSIA in December 2020. No reply received. And then it speaks to the NSIA apparently having revived the initiative in 2022, February 2022. And this time it says there's a memo that ultimately wasn't provided to PMO. So with that sort of overview of all of this, Mr. Clow, can you explain what was happening here? And we can take that document down before you start, Mr. Clow, and pull up WIT 163 again, the discussion starting at paragraph 35. So, Mr. Clow, tell us what happened here.
So I'll start where you started, which was the NSICOP report from this spring. When we received that report in April, I certainly read that paragraph, and quite quickly, a few of us had conversations, including with the National Security Intelligence Advisor, Nathalie Drouin. The Prime Minister was involved in a conversation about this. We all agreed this briefing, this unclassified briefing, should happen, and that's what led directly to the briefings happening in June of this year. And we all agreed they should have happened long ago. So I'm happy to go back to the two notes that were referenced that were sent to the Prime Minister's office in 2019 and 2020.
Sure, and well, as you do that, we can pull up the documents themselves, actually. So the first one is CAN 19825. That's the December 2019 memo. Go ahead, Mr. Clow.
So this was the first one that was received shortly before Christmas 2019. I should point out, notes like this, we did our research ahead of this testimony and previous testimony in camera. The Prime Minister receives about 1,000 notes from PCO sent to him every year. I would say 1,000 on average. One year was 1,200, one year was a little bit less. So, and these notes cover every conceivable topic in government and every decision he makes, including budget decisions. So this was one of those 1,000.
When you say the Prime Minister receives, do you mean PMO receives for?
PMO receives them, but they're destined for the Prime Minister.
Understood.
Any note that's listed for decision, the process in our office is Prime Minister's office staff consider that. We apply our own political advice on top of it. Sometimes we consult caucus if necessary, as an example. We may have stakeholder knowledge that could feed into advice that goes to the Prime Minister. So this note was being treated like every other note that gets addressed to him. January, February 2020, this note was being considered. We all agreed this briefing should happen. This note should go to the Prime Minister. And it was interrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Early March, as we all know, 2020, the whole world changed, the country changed. Parliament itself stopped sitting. So this note was interrupted and it did not go to the Prime Minister.
Okay. So it essentially got lost in the shuffle of the pandemic?
Yes, and there was at least one other note at the same time that was paused like this one.
Okay. If we take that one down then and pull up the December 2020 memo. So this is CAN 19435. Oh, there it is. So again, this is now a memo that was destined for the PM from the NSIA, sent just before Christmas in 2020. Mr. Clow, what happened with this one?
So similar but different set of facts on this one. It arrived shortly before Christmas. It was considered in the new year. Policy staff engaged on the topic. Katie and I engaged on the topic. On this one, we all agreed again that this briefing should happen. The note should go to the Prime Minister. We supplemented the advice from PCO with a couple of different things. One, we recommended that in addition to all members of Parliament getting this unclassified briefing, the leader of the Green Party, who at that time did not have a seat in Parliament, should also get the briefing. So we talked about that and we inserted that advice into the note. Attached to this note were draft letters that the Prime Minister was meant to send to opposition leaders, informing them of this effort. So we also, as we often do, any letter from the Prime Minister to an opposition leader, that's going to be something that could become very political. So we looked at that letter and applied our advice there. The note was working its way through the system, and ultimately this note was interrupted by the 2021 election call, and it was not resurfaced after the 2021 election.
Okay. So just to show a little bit of what you were talking about, if I can ask the registrar to just scroll through the document until you see the draft letters to the opposition parties. It's probably going to have to go quite a way down to find those. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm not going to pull all of them up, but some of the discussions that you mentioned are included in documents for the commission. So we understand there was some discussion in February 2021, and Mr. Travers, that discussion was in the context of a potential briefing or a briefing to the PM that was to happen that day. Do you have a recollection of whether this came up during that briefing on February 9th, 2021?
I do not recall this specifically coming up in that briefing.
Okay.
It was a broad update briefing on foreign interference, and it included countries of concern, their tactics, some examples. I think I've spoken to that briefing at other stages of the.
That's the briefing that you told us about in stage 1 of the Commission's proceedings. Okay.
Could I offer a couple other reflections on this topic?
Please do.
So one important point to emphasize is members of parliament were getting a lot of information on the topic of foreign interference at the time these two notes were being considered. Minister Blair wrote a letter to every single member of parliament in December 2020 informing members of parliament of the threats of foreign interference and what the government of Canada was doing in response. And again, that went to every single member of parliament. CSIS, as we know, was conducting numerous threat reduction measure meetings. They were meeting directly with dozens and dozens of members of parliament, including, I think it's important to point out, some of the members of parliament that have been that have appeared at this commission. Jenny Kwan, Kenny Chu, Michael Chong, all got direct briefings from CSIS around this time. The Conservative Party of Canada, the cleared party representatives were getting briefings at this time. So I'm sure some will look at this and say members of parliament got no information because these two notes were interrupted, and it's just not the case. A lot of information was flowing. I would also point out when members of parliament are sworn in, they get security briefings from the House of Commons, from the Sergeant at Arms, which covers some of the information that would have been in this unclassified briefing. All of that said, with hindsight, of course, looking back, these notes should have moved faster. They should have got to the Prime Minister. The briefing, everyone would have been better off if the unclassified briefing happened then instead of June 2024. But the absence of this unclassified briefing back in 2019, 2020, I believe it had very limited impact on the overall issue.
Okay.
Could I just jump in quickly there? I just, two quick things. One is, if it was seen as something, I agree with what Mr. Cloud just said, but if it was something seen as paramount that had to happen, that there was a sense of urgency behind it across the system, then there are a number of different ways it can be brought to our attention. It can be brought directly to the Prime Minister's attention. And it's not to say it's not important. It has now happened. It will continue to happen. I agree with everything Mr. Cloud said, but we were having meetings like the one in February, for example, that you referenced to Mr. Travers, where there were so many other elements that were being seen as priority and urgent on this same thematic on foreign interference. And this was not one of the ones coming forward from the senior-most officials saying, we've got to push this through tomorrow. We all take responsibility on this one, but I think it's worth realizing there was not a vacuum of work being done on foreign interference at the time. There was actually a tremendous amount happening at that time, including the number of meetings and briefings and other notes coming through on it. And that's despite the interruption of COVID and everything else. And then there were, and I think whether or not this made a material difference, I think is an important question, because I have yet to see even retroactively how it might have. It doesn't mean it shouldn't have happened, but given all the other tools, and then even having seen it happen recently, it's a pretty high-level briefing, and I think it has become something of more emphasis than perhaps it should.
Okay.
Could I make one final comment on this? Would it be possible to pull up that 2019 note one more time?
Sure. The doc ID is 19435.
And if you scroll, I think it's page 5 out of 6, you'll see a placemat which spoke to some of the things that were proposed to be briefed. Maybe it's further down. This document seems to have 27 pages.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's 19825.
This is exactly the.
No, this is what you were looking for?
Yes.
Okay.
So this placemat was included in that first note that came to the Prime Minister's office, and it gives you a sense of what the briefing, the unclassified briefing, was going to be. It talks about things like protecting yourself from blackmail by foreign diplomats, protecting your personal telephone devices, being aware that it could be hacked. So that's why I say this briefing, while important, has value. It should not be overstated what this briefing was. It was very general information about how to protect yourself against certain FI techniques. It was not specific information. It was not classified information. It was very general.
One last thing is around, there is a question, and I know we've discussed this in previous encounters, is who has the authority to make a decision around such briefings as well? And because I think our understanding and looking back too, and probably should have been our first answer at the time when the note came through, is this doesn't actually require the Prime Minister to sign off on it. If there is a reason that security agencies want to go to the Sergeant-at-Arms or go to Parliament and ensure that certain security measures and briefings are taken, they have the authority to do that. The Prime Minister, I'm actually certain, if this question had been put to him, would have encouraged and said, what can we do to support, because that was his general response to every briefing he got on foreign interference involving members of Parliament would be, what can we tell that member of Parliament? Can you do a threat reduction measure? Is there something else that can be done to communicate with this member, this flag that you're raising with me? And so I'm certain he would have encouraged more interaction with parliamentarians rather than less, but it doesn't actually need to go through him, is our understanding as well.
Okay, just to go back on that point, we did hear from the CSIS director that from his vantage point, in order to give these sort of broad briefings to Parliament, it's not something CSIS would undertake alone. They would have to work with the Sergeant-at-Arms, the Usher of the Black Rod, I suppose, at the Senate, the Public Safety, and then with PCO. And I believe he said that PCO sort of links to PMO, but what you're telling us here is that the Prime Minister, the PMO itself, does not need to be involved in your view.
That is our view. And Mr. Vigneault said further, he said here, sitting at this table in April, he did not require permission to conduct those briefings. Yes, CSIS absolutely required assistance and needed to work with the House of Commons and other departments in order to do a proper briefing, but it did not require the Prime Minister's written sign-off. That said, we did not communicate that in 2019 and 2020 when these notes came in. We processed them, as I described, as every other note was processed. With the benefit of hindsight, we should have said at the time, you don't need the Prime Minister's approval, this should just happen. And in conclusion, that is what happened this year. When NSICOP resurfaced this issue, we all discussed, we looked at each other and said, the briefing should happen, let's just make it happen. Then it happened.
Okay, what was PMO's involvement in the June briefings?
In this spring?
That's right.
It was the conversation I just referenced. It was.
But we weren't involved in the briefings
Exactly.
themselves
We
of
were
the
not involved.
parliamentarians at all.
Okay. Two quick things before we leave this topic, which has taken a little while. The February 2022 memo that is referenced in the NSICOP report, is there anything that you can tell us about that? It says in the NSICOP report that it was never sent.
It was never sent. We never heard from PCO in the form of a note after the 2021 election about these unclassified briefings.
Okay. And then finally, Mr. Clow, I think you referred to this. Can we just pull up CAN 003326? You mentioned a letter having been sent by Minister Blair in 2020. I don't think that's been mentioned in the record so far. So if we just scroll down here, scroll through the pages, please. Is this the letter to which you're referring?
Yes, it is.
And this was sent to all parliamentarians at the time?
All parliamentarians.
Okay. Okay, moving now to a rather different topic. We can take that document down and pull up WIT 163 again, starting at paragraph 47. So this topic now is the PNGing of Mr. Zhao Wei. And I'll just start introducing this topic by asking you about the intelligence that was circulated in 2021 on the PRC's interest in Michael Chong. So first of all, when did you first hear allegations that the PRC had some interest in targeting Michael Chong specifically? Did that come to your attention in 2021 or subsequently?
No, it was from the Globe and Mail on May 1st, 2023.
Okay, so the intelligence products that we've been talking about in the commission that were produced in 2021 were never reached you?
Correct.
Okay. And if I ask you about the concept of a CSIS issues management brief, an IMU from CSIS, is that a kind of document, a type of document that you would be used to seeing, used to receiving?
No.
No. Okay, so those were not destined for you. Moving then to the sequence of events that started in May 2023, can the registrar please pull up CAN 19500? Mr. Clow, you will recognize these as your notes, and zoom out so we can see that the entirety of that note, please, on the first page. Thank you. So this is dated May 7th, but I think we've talked about this already. That's a mistake. It should actually be May 2nd. So this is the day after the Globe and Mail article appears, and it seems to speak to 3 separate meetings. So Mr. Clow, I'll just ask you to start by walking us through what happened that day based on your notes.
Sure. So this was the day after the Globe and Mail story. The Prime Minister was in his office in West Block. So the first third of my notes speak to the first discussion he had that day on this topic, which was with his officials, including David Vigneault, which is represented there as DV. I'm sure I was there for sure, Katie was there, and we were discussing the facts, what was contained in the Globe and Mail story, and we were going through that. As a part of that, as you see reflected in my notes, Mr. Vigneault informed the Prime Minister that Mr. Chong had received defensive briefs in 2021 and 2022 where he was, I won't explain what defensive briefs are, I think that's been covered here, but he was met very directly by CSIS. That said, he has testified and CSIS has as well. He was not given specific information in those meetings. They were not able to give him classified information. That discussion happened shortly before the Prime Minister met with Mr. Chong. I believe Mr. Vigneault and Ms. Thomas sat in on that meeting, and my notes there are, I was not in that meeting, but my very brief notes there reflect what the Prime Minister told us after having met with Mr. Chong. Mr. Chong was asking, is the individual in question, Zhao Wei, is he still in the country, still in Canada? The Prime Minister said they're doing their due diligence on whether what was reported in the Globe and Mail was accurate or not. Mr. Chong said to the Prime Minister, I suggest to you, Prime Minister, the threshold for expulsion is diplomatic, not criminal. And the Prime Minister then said to Mr. Chong, you should meet with officials now and get properly briefed on the facts here. That meeting then happened between Ms. Thomas and Mr. Vigneault and Mr. Chong. After that, where you see the notes say 2 p.m., Mr. Vigneault and Ms. Thomas debriefed the Prime Minister and us on how that discussion with Mr. Chong went.
Okay. And if we just keep scrolling down the document, you'll see the end of that note. So again, can you walk us through what was happening in this part of the discussion and Ms. Thomas's note at the end? So
this is me noting what Jody Thomas was relating to us in terms of the main focus of Mr. Chong in that briefing. He was obviously interested in the facts around the issue, who the diplomat was. He was asking, what did officials do? Marta refers to Marta Morgan, who was the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time. Discussions around whether the Chinese diplomat should be PNG, that's what you see there. And my notes conclude with Jody reporting to us that she told Mr. Chong that her belief was that it was a bureaucratic, it was a bureaucratic breakdown, I see it right, wrote, that the information did not get to the Prime Minister, to the Minister of Public Safety, or us.
Okay. Scrolling back up to that first page, where it says, sorry, a little less than that there, where it says, Mr. Vigneault is reported to have said it was not a direct threat, but it's a concern. What was your understanding at the time of what the nature of this targeting or concern was?
As we got briefed, my recollection is that the information contained in the intelligence report was not a physical threat to Mr. Chong or his family. It was the gathering of information.
Okay. And given what broke in the news yesterday, where we have a situation of the RCMP having made public statements about the involvement of Indian diplomats having gathered information and done certain things with it in terms of intimidation, harassment, plots to murder, and the other things they reported on yesterday. I just want to confirm, which resulted in the PNGing of 6 diplomats. I just want to confirm that that was not your understanding of what the nature of this targeting was of Mr. Chong in 20?
No.
Okay. So continuing in the chronology, if we pull up the CAN 18000, a May 6th meeting, and just again zoom out so we can see that note. So here at the beginning of that note, it says JT spoke, JT would be Jody Thomas, spoke to the RCMP, and that report's Chong called, but the RCMP doesn't have much to say. Mr. Cloud, can you tell us about this part of the conversation?
So this meeting was a couple of days before Zhao Wei was PNG'd, and this was one of several discussions that happened. Sometimes it included the Prime Minister, sometimes not, where we were discussing what to do, how to handle the situation, and ultimately it led to the expulsion of Zhao Wei.
Okay, and if we just go down to the next document, then it's a May 7th meeting, CAN 018001. So again, this is a discussion, looks like it's some updates, discussion of deadlines, and we know that if eventually not eventually, the next day, May 8th, the decision was made by the Minister of Foreign Affairs to declare Mr. Zhao Wei PNG'd. What was your understanding of why that decision was made?
It was, I believe you've heard testimony from David Morrison, current Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I believe he described it well, that it was not that Zhao Wei was directly involved necessarily in information gathering on Michael Chong, but it was due to other things that intelligence showed that individual had done over time, and that the country of China had done over time in Canada. So all of that amounted to and culminated in the decision to expel that individual.
Sorry, Shantona, if I can just very briefly, I think it's just important to note that when Deputy Morrison testified, this did come after extensive engagement on a range of different behaviors that we had concerns about with China. So there was a real accumulation of behavior that we found problematic. So I want to stress just how much had led to this point in terms of Canada expressing through all levels our concern about Chinese behavior and the different nature of that behavior, including balloons, foreign interference, the Michaels. So it's important to have that record when you understand this decision.
Okay. Culmination of events then, understood. That time I didn't notice that you wanted to say something, so thank you.
I have one question. Since how long did you have these concerns at the time about various behaviors?
I mean, I think we've had those behaviors where I think we've testified to it. On those specific issues, much of the information was in public with respect to our ongoing issues with the Michaels, with respect to the spy balloons, as they're called. And generally, I think we've had concerns about Chinese behavior as we have testified over the years. And so all of them had been accumulating, and we had not seen a response from China to our diplomatic efforts that we viewed as appropriate at that stage.
Okay, moving to a completely different topic. If we can pull up 163 again, WIT 163. some discussion at paragraph 29. Vulnerabilities of political party processes to foreign interference. So the Commission's heard quite a bit of evidence regarding exactly that, the vulnerability of various party processes, nomination races, leadership races to foreign interference. And one of the things that the Commissioner will be considering is whether there are ways in which to address some of those. We also know that Elections Canada is in the process of putting together some suggestions in that regard. So I'll just ask you, first of all, what's your reaction to first of all, the vulnerabilities having been identified and possible solutions to these problems in terms of whether increased regulation of political parties is feasible or advisable, or any other things that can be done to ameliorate the space?
So, look, I think it's as we've seen even over the course of the last number of months, let alone the last number of years prior to this inquiry, it's an evolving landscape. And it is why, since we first formed government, there has been step after step after step that has been taken, and there are more steps that need to be taken. So whether it's, looking at the Election Modernization Act, whether it was the rapid response mechanisms, there are so many different pieces, site, panel, protocol, there's so many different pieces that have come into play that we're still, I think, and by we, I don't just mean the government, I mean political parties, I mean Elections Canada, are all still learning from. In the 2019 election was the first time that there was such a site task force involved, and there was a review done of that, and then the 2021 was only the second time, and there was a review done of that, and there were changes made after each of those instances, and then there were changes subsequent to the 2021 campaign in terms of applying those same mechanisms to by-elections now. And so, and that's just one stream of the work. I think what we've seen in terms of vulnerabilities, and I think there probably are more or different ones even than as has been identified to date. But I think getting into, and this is as much a personal opinion and based on personal experience from once upon a time having been involved on the party side, which I'm not now, but my observation would be it's a pretty complex space to enter into greater regulation within nominations, for example, which I know has obviously been one of the areas of particular interest during the inquiry because of some of the issues raised. And I think it's complex because I think different political parties make different choices because of different principles that they stand by on how their political parties should operate, what their primary focus is when it comes to a nomination, when it comes to how they create their membership and their supporter base and so on. Different parties have different membership fees or no membership fees in the case in the case of the Liberal Party. And they have different ages, they have different rules around who can participate in a nomination race or not. So making choices that makes all of that the same for everyone would really upend how political parties operate right now. And I think there are good reasons that the different political parties make these choices. So I have found some of the conversation, not here in this room, but in the broader kind of conversation that's been going on around all of this. There's become almost a view that there's some simple answer to how this works, and I'm sure as you've been seeing, there is no one simple answer, at least that I have seen. I'm sure there are things that could maybe be tightened up or strengthened. Political parties need to look at that. I think there are best practices that could be shared, greater information flow. I think cleared party representatives, for example, which every political party should and needs to have, I think, at all times, and that has not been consistent in the last period of time. And those political parties need those cleared party representatives so that they can get the information, even if they can't act in the moment, because more often than not, the information we're given or a political party is given, they're told you can't do anything with this because you could burn the source or whatever else. And so, but having that information, it might actually help in terms of putting something together that you might have known about that potential candidate, for example, from other information that you might have at the party. Different political parties have different processes on how they vet candidates. So they might have had other information, and when they hear that bit of information, it kind of puts a puzzle together, and there is a way they can act that wouldn't harm anything. Or maybe it helps them in the future. By knowing that information then, if something else comes up in the future, it completes a picture. So having that information, I think, is so very important, having that ongoing dialogue between security agencies and political parties, not only on potential flags on candidates, but also just on anything they're seeing around processes, around cyber, which is becoming an increasingly significant issue for political parties, let alone for levels of government and for corporations to deal with. I think that is hugely important. But I think in terms of trying to come up with common standards across the different political parties when it comes to nominations, it would be very difficult, to say the least, and I'm not sure it would be accomplishing or solving for the problems as they've been identified. And just the last thing I'll say on this is Mr. Broadhurst spoke to this in stage one a fair bit in terms of the Liberal Party specifically and the robustness that goes along with the processes involved in the party. There are many lawyers involved. There are appeals processes. There are complaint processes that can be availed of, and many eyes in terms of scrutineers, and it's quite a formalized process that a nomination goes through. And so I think one first has to identify what the problem is or where the weakness is in order to strengthen it, which I'm not clear on myself at this point.
Okay, and I think we've heard evidence that all of the political parties have similar processes in terms of checks and balances in their own systems. But are we looking at a situation where maybe the political parties need to look inwards and make sure that the processes are working as they should?
I think political parties should be doing that on a regular basis. And obviously there are additional layers to things that they now know through this process and through what they've been learning by having had cleared party representatives in the last 2 elections working with officials. So they should absolutely be responding to that both in the moment and over time in terms of what that should mean for how they operate.
Okay. You mentioned that when information is received by a political party, and we know that also in addition to other things, Bill C-70 is intended to ease some of that information sharing, but there are limits to what a political party can do with it, having received that information. Can you speak to that a bit? So what is it? What are the options that are before you when, hypothetically, you receive information about something having gone wrong in the system, a certain candidate, a certain piece of intelligence? What can you do?
So it really depends on when you're receiving the information and what information you're receiving as to what your option set could look like, from my experience anyways. And I think one of the things that I have certainly heard and have experienced on my own is that the earlier you receive this information within a process of vetting candidates, the more straightforward it might be to take some action that isn't revealing in the ways that the security agencies would be concerned about. Whereas if the person is already elected, let alone even a nominated candidate, how you respond, if you receive information you're told you cannot reveal to anyone under any circumstance, and any action you might take could reveal that, and you don't have any other reasons to take actions at that point because they are a confirmed nominated candidate or even more complicated, an elected member of parliament, that's where, I think it will be very interesting to see the guidance of the commission on this going forward. And because I think that is one of the areas of strain between security agencies and political parties and leaders on this. And leader is an important part of this because leaders have authorities within, I believe, within all political parties in these areas. And so the leaders have to be cleared as well so that they can then work with the party representatives to figure out what to do. And then I think, as I said a few moments ago, the information, even if you can't act in that moment, if it is too far down a path, or there is just nothing you can do that wouldn't create a vulnerability from the security agency standpoint. And those are conversations that I would encourage to happen, for that to go back and forth, and for there to be a bit of a push and pull between the party reps and the security agencies to really figure out, is there truly nothing that can be done? And that's something we do regularly when we're going through vetting processes and other things on the government side of things. But if there's nothing that can be done in that moment, the information is still valuable, I believe, for the party representatives and the leaders to know, because they should want to know what is going on around them, and it could influence decisions they make going forward, what roles that person maybe should or should not have. Or maybe there's reason later to have questions about whether that person should continue to be the nominated candidate, and if you also have this information in your mind, that completes a picture in a different way. So I think it just can only help a leader to have that information, which is why we encourage all leaders to get their clearance.
Okay, just going back a bit to, in terms of what political parties may need in this space, when the political parties were before the commission and each of the executive or national directors came and testified, one thing they seemed hungry for was more information about what they can possibly do. So do you see a space at least where guidelines for best practices could be provided sort of across the board for the political parties to take in and use as they see fit?
I think the more best practices and information that can be shared, the more expertise that can be brought to this, the more that can be learned from other jurisdictions. Though frankly, Canada is a global leader in much of what we're doing in this space at this point, and other countries are coming to us to learn at the moment. But I think the more of that, the stronger the whole political system will be, for sure.
Okay. Moving to a different topic now then, or actually before we leave this, I just want to ask you one thing, and I'll ask it fairly generally, although if we can pull up WIT 163 around paragraph 72. Obviously, as in your positions now, you receive a fair amount of intelligence having to do with foreign interference. What happens when that intelligence has to do not with foreign interference within your party, but potentially foreign interference or allegations thereof in an opposition party? Can you speak to that at all?
So this is an area that has changed with the ministerial directive, which came from the Minister of Public Safety following the leaks involving Michael Chong. Prior to that, I would say generally, if not entirely, but certainly the majority of the time, and it goes back to a question you asked earlier about whether names showed up in intelligence. Names didn't show up in intelligence. And when we would ask to have, particularly Canadian names, as I mentioned, and we will sometimes ask, can we know who this is, to complete the picture, and the Crow will take that away and discuss it with the NSIA, who will discuss it with the security agency lead to determine whether it's something that makes sense to share. And I would surmise that it was a general reluctance to share, and understandable, to share opposition party names in particular in these cases. Having said that, we now do see more of that because of the ministerial directive. Okay. I don't know if you want to add anything.
I would just emphasize one thing Katie said. To me, the single biggest way we can fight foreign interference with the information that exists and is contained within CSIS is finding a way to better inform opposition parties and the government, although the government gets way more information, but inform opposition parties of specific intelligence that does exist. And it pertains to all of them. Some of their candidates, some of their nomination processes. NSICOP highlighted alleged foreign interference from the government of India in the Conservative Party leadership race. Getting that information to the decision makers in those parties, it has improved, but I think it can further improve. C-70 will help, but I do believe there's a cultural reluctance to share information with political parties that has improved over time, culture within the institutions, I mean, and that I think needs to change.
Having said that, they can't in that particular instance because the leader hasn't got cleared. So I think that is true right up to a point. And then if they wanted to share it now, it becomes incredibly difficult.
Okay, speaking of the NSICOP report, have you read the classified version of that report?
Yes.
Yes.
Mr. Travers as well? All of them. Okay. We've heard some evidence in this proceeding about the NSICOP report, and CSIS was examined on it insofar as they can be in a public setting, because most of that report was based on CSIS information. Two things came out of that I want to ask you about. One is that in the context, and there's some discussion of this at, I think it's WIT 136 around paragraph 12, in the context of a TRM, a threat reduction measure, that CSIS performed, one of the things they heard back was that the MPs they were speaking to as part of this TRM weren't necessarily sure where the lines were, where the boundaries were, and what they should be doing, and specifically in their interactions with foreign officials. So that's something that I wanted to ask you, in your experience and having read what you've read about the NSICOP report and the events reported in it. Are those lines clear, and do MPs know, do parliamentarians know enough about where those lines are and what they should and should not be doing?
I have a few thoughts on this. One, I don't think you would find agreement within government on what the line is. And I do believe security agencies and individuals within them sometimes do view what we would see as normal routine behavior. Some individuals in security agencies may view that as crossing a line. So even finding agreement on what the line is, it would be challenging within government. So for sure, members of parliament, when they are meeting with CSIS and these conversations happen, I'm not at all surprised that there's confusion about what constitutes inappropriate behavior or not. Further, in these meetings, as we just discussed and has been well covered at this commission, because CSIS can't and doesn't provide classified information, these meetings can often be so general that the member of parliament doesn't even know what it is can leave the room not fully knowing what it is they're being warned off of or what they should be nervous about. So yes, it's confusing.
Anyone else have anything to add on that before I move on to other questions? Okay. So on the note, the topic of helping in this space and helping with that confusion, you know, we've heard about a briefing initiative to parliamentarians that we talked about at great length earlier. Is there room for more education, at least, even if that line isn't perfectly clear, of helping parliamentarians understand where it may be and what are at least the red flags and the no-nos that they should be on the lookout for?
Absolutely.
Okay. And then last thing I'll ask on this is something that I know you already talked about at stage one and came up again in the discussion of the NSICOP report, is the nature of intelligence and the need to understand the caveats that are put on it and not to take it for necessarily one piece of intelligence, certainly, or for more than it is. Can you speak to that in the context of your receipt of intelligence and what you do with it when you receive it?
I'm happy to offer a few reflections. I think as anyone who works more regularly in the national security and intelligence space will tell you, intelligence is not evidence. It is information that is collected by a variety of means. It is often imperfect information. It can be, for example, transcripts or overheard conversations of opinions offered by a third-party source. And raw intelligence in particular arrives simply as information. And so we were, I would say, almost taught on taking these jobs to be very careful to understand the contingency of intelligence. And there is a whole robust system around how reliable a piece of intelligence is. It could be how reliable a source is. This is the regular business of the intelligence community, precisely because it deals so often in contingent and imperfect information. And so it's one of the reasons why careful analysis is so important. It's one of the reasons why healthy debate about conclusions and facts is so important. And it's one reason that you have to be very careful not to, speaking very generally here, you have to be very careful not to draw direct lines where direct lines do not exist. It is contingent information and needs to be understood as what it is.
I would just add that we take, and I think I can say this collectively, we take everything we receive from the security agencies extremely seriously. And if we see anything of concern in terms of something that we feel needs to be immediately followed up on, or that they flag as something we need to follow up on or have concern around an individual, we will stop things in their tracks until we've had that discussion and understand things. So for example, in a vetting process, if a flag comes up because of some piece of information that's coming through, we will stop. And that person is, unfortunately, potentially, especially if the information turns out to not be the case, we will stop everything in terms of moving that person forward in their role until that gets sorted out. And if it can't get sorted out, they will sometimes get frozen in their role for an indefinite period of time. It's also imperfect information in the sense of you can't with certainty know the motivation of a source. And so it's interesting sometimes, this happens rarely, but sometimes when it's information that you actually know ourselves, our experience. And so when we've seen intelligence, for example, in one instance where I can't obviously get into the details, but where it referenced a meeting happening that we knew with certainty had never happened. And only we could know that. Of course, the analyst that was getting that information together and passing it up through the system wouldn't know whether that meeting did or didn't happen. They just had that intelligence. We could correct that, however, because we happened to be involved in one instance. And so what was the motivation of that source if you know that that is not accurate? And it actually led to a really interesting and I think healthy conversation around how it's important to continue to have that intelligence because it tells you something about the source and leads to the creation of a bigger picture. But it also tells you that you are going to receive information that is, comes from different motivations and that is not always accurate. Because to Mr. Travers's point, it is not evidence, it is not fact that you're reading when you're reading these intel reports. And so you really have to look at a whole lot of different pieces to be able to put it together a bigger picture. And it's why we also rely so heavily on the senior officials who have an even bigger picture than we do to narrow what it is we need to know and when.
Ce sont mes questions. Those are my questions.
Those are my questions.
We'll take the break, 20 minutes break, so we'll come back at 11:15.
Order, please. À l'ordre, s'il vous plaît. This sitting of the Commission is now in